The wind cut sharply across the frosty plains north of the wall, howling with a restless intensity that never seemed to cease. Darkness blanketed the tundra, and the pale lights of distant stars were mere pinpricks against a night that threatened to devour all. Yet even amidst the gloom, a cold, unnatural glow emanated from forms that moved with silent purpose across the ice. They were the White Walkers, tall, eerily regal figures whose very presence drained warmth from the air. Their eyes burned a dreadful blue, like glacial fire. They marched southward at a deliberate pace. Had anyone from the Night's Watch been brave or foolish enough to stand beneath the frozen eaves of the northern forest, they might have glimpsed that legion of the dead and the icy commanders leading them. But in this realm beyond the wall, men were sparse. The free folk who once roamed here had gone or fallen, leaving the trackless wilderness even more haunted and bare. Now, the powers of winter advanced unchecked. For centuries, the wall had stood as the first line of defense, a monolithic barrier that men believed would hold back any threat. But all walls have weaknesses, especially when ancient terrors find hidden paths or spells to circumvent them. Word traveled slowly, carried by terrified scouts. The White Walkers were not content to gather and build their strength. They had discovered a route or conjured some foul sorcery that allowed them to slip past the northern ramparts before the Watch could muster a proper defense. At Castle Black, the ancient keep at the wall's center, horns had sounded to warn of the enemy. A message was dispatched to the lords of the Seven Kingdoms, but ravens flew sluggishly in winter winds, and too few in the south believed. Those who heeded the old tales were drowned out by voices claiming it was naught but northern superstition. A war-weary realm had no time for myths. In this swirl of chaos, our protagonist, Ser Jorun Starkwood, an unheralded knight once sworn to serve in the War of the Five Kings, found himself on the edges of the land gifted to the Watch ages past. He possessed neither the high birth of great lords nor the cunning of seasoned knights. Yet in these dire times, even a lesser knight with a strong sword arm was precious. Jorun had traveled north in search of purpose, lured by rumors of darkness beyond imagining. He had grown weary of lords squabbling over crowns and chairs, while a deadlier threat crept at the world's edge. He believed it the duty of any knight worth his spurs to protect the realm, no matter the cost. If the realm was truly threatened by an evil beyond mortal ken, all the more reason to oppose it. He arrived at Castle Black exhausted from the long ride, his cloak stiff with mud and frost, a battered shield strapped across his shoulder. A handful of Black brothers ushered him in, grim-faced but not unkind. Within hours, he stood among rangers and new recruits, many with haunted eyes that spoke of horrors witnessed in the frozen north. The Lord Commander, Talit, a practical man thrust into command by circumstance, greeted Jorun briefly. A single curt nod and handshake conveyed the gravity of the situation. That night, Jorun dined on watery broth, hushed conversations punctuating the gloom. Words like White Walkers, Whites, and Army of the Dead passed between trembling lips. Tales of dragons and rival kings in the far south felt like distant dreams compared to the immediate threat here. No ravens returned from the southern lords, or if they had, their news was dire. Scouts whispered that countless dead roamed under the icy general's command. Jorun felt a cold trickle of fear down his spine. The notion of an unstoppable horde of walking corpses was nearly too much to comprehend. Yet resolve kindled within him. If the others, these White Walkers, came in force, they must be met with steel. Before dawn, the horn sounded thrice, an alarm for the others. Men scrambled from bedrolls, half-dressed, voices cracking with panic. Jorun seized his Valyrian steel longsword, inherited from his mother's line, and hurried to the yard. Amid torchlight, Black brothers and volunteers assembled in disarray. Orders were shouted, mostly drowned by the wind. But the message was clear. The dead were at the tree line. They must be stopped before breaching the castle gates. Led by a scattering of rangers, the defenders filed beyond the walls, weapons drawn. The night air stung like knives. The snow-covered trees towered before them like silent witnesses. Jorun felt something indescribably ancient lurking in the darkness. The men formed a ragged line, trembling under the cosmic chill. Some held bows, a few readied spears, others hefted swords. Their breath rose in ragged plumes. Then the White Walkers emerged, pale shapes gliding soundlessly among the trees. Their eyes glowed an unholy blue, capturing what little light there was. Jorun's heart hammered. He had expected them to be monstrous abominations, but these beings were eerily beautiful, thin and tall, clad in armor that appeared carved from living ice. One lifted a spear of translucent frost. No roar or battle cry was uttered, only a terrible silence, as though they were confident in their inevitable victory. The White Walker strode forward. A black brother tried to raise his shield in defense, but the spear shattered it effortlessly, driving on to impale the man's chest. He died instantly, eyes wide with shock. Joran lunged, swinging his Valyrian steel sword in a desperate arc. The creature twisted, but not fast enough. The blade grazed its torso. Blue light flared in its eyes, and it hissed, an alien sound of pain. Elsewhere, men fought smaller battles. The whites appeared from the gloom, decaying figures in tattered clothes, eyes vacant but for the same blue glow. They attacked with reckless abandon, unaffected by injuries that would kill any living creature. A severed arm still twitched in the snow, grasping. The defenders cried out, many succumbing to panic. Yet some found their courage and pressed on, hacking at the undead despite the stench of rot and the sickening horror of fighting corpses. In that midnight chaos, Joran became separated from his companions. Another walker stalked him, silent as a phantom. It moved with inhuman speed, forcing Joran to parry blow after blow. Cold reverberated through his bones each time their weapons clashed. With a final lunge, the walker's icy sword slashed, nearly catching Joran's shoulder. In a surge of adrenaline, he spun, bringing his Valyrian steel blade across the walker's flank. The creature let out a piercing shriek, and its body cracked, fracturing into shards. In a blink, it disintegrated in a swirl of frozen dust. Overwhelmed, the remaining white walkers and whites retreated back into the trees. The defenders panted, staring at the mangled corpses of their friends scattered among the slain whites. The survivors limped to Castle Black, a flicker of triumph mingling with heartbreak. Joran, shaking from adrenaline and cold, slumped against a makeshift barricade inside the walls. He had survived the first engagement, but he knew it was only a foretaste of the horrors to come. Lord Commander Talit summoned him soon after. In a cramped chamber lit by a single candle, Talit studied hand-drawn maps. "I saw you kill one of them," he said, his voice subdued. "Valyrian steel." Joran nodded, too exhausted for pride. "They can be killed, my lord, but there were too many, and they'll be back." Talit's expression hardened. "We can't simply wait here to be overrun. They're slipping south by ways we don't fully understand. I need rangers to scout, find how they're crossing. Maybe block or collapse those passages. You'll lead a small party, fewer than 10 men." Though fatigue weighed on him, Joran felt a renewed sense of duty. "I'll do it," he said, "whatever it takes to stop them." He gathered his gear, joined by 4 black brothers, 2 free folk hunters, Harrick and Runa, and a tall, quiet woman named Elisand, who had her own reasons for coming north. They set out under a somber dawn, the cold wind biting at their cheeks. Beyond the wall's shadow, they ventured into the deep wilderness, searching for clues. Days passed in tense silence. The ground revealed occasional footprints, far too large and widely spaced to belong to normal men. They found an abandoned village, the inhabitants turned to frozen corpses. Some bore savage wounds. Others had died barricaded inside huts. The unnatural cold clung to every corner, a testament to the passing of dark forces. Each mile brought them closer to rumored sites where the wall's ancient foundations met hidden caves or cracks. On the second night, a scream tore the quiet apart. Joran and the others rushed to investigate, moving stealthily under starlight. In a clearing, they saw a white walker transforming living captives into whites. Cold radiated from its pale hand, and the victims collapsed, eyes glazing over with blue light. Horror ripped through Joran, and he signaled the archers. Arrows flew, felling a couple of whites, but the White Walker called more undead to swarm. The small party fled, narrowly escaping with their lives. One black brother suffered a bite that festered. Ultimately, Harrick and Runa split from the group to take him back to Castle Black. Pressing on, Joran's remaining companions scouted further until they discovered a hidden fissure at the base of a sheer cliff. An unnatural, frigid wind blew from within. By torchlight, they crept into the tunnel, hearts pounding. Deep inside, they stumbled upon two White Walker sentinels guarding a vast cavern. Battle erupted. Elisande fought fiercely with her short sword, though only Joran's Valyrian steel could truly shatter the walkers. Even so, they lost more men. Blood iced on the cavern floor before their bodies hit the ground. Yet the survivors realized this cavern likely led under the wall itself. An ancient secret route or a new tear forced open by foul magic. Determined, they labored to collapse the passage, hacking at the stone pillars and using ropes to topple a load-bearing column. With a thunderous crash, the ceiling caved in, sealing the tunnel. It might not be permanent, but it could slow the White Walkers and their undead thralls. Battered, they retraced their steps to Castle Black, only to realize that the threat extended well beyond one hidden passage. If there was one route, there could be more. If the others had already breached the wall, they could be halfway to Winterfell by now. Joran resolved to take word south, to warn the Stark leadership. Winter was here and the dead with it. They rode south across the Gift, the trees thinning as they approached the farmland that fed the Watch. The land looked ravaged, fields crusted in frost, livestock missing or slaughtered. Villages lay silent, broken doors swinging in the wind. Once or twice, they encountered handfuls of survivors too shell-shocked to offer more than whispered warnings. An old man in one hamlet insisted he heard mention of Whitebridge Ford, as if the Whites had some dreadful plan to cross the rivers and move deeper into the realm. Eventually, Joran and his companions saw the great walls of Winterfell rising against the sky, the Stark banners limply stirring. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, but the castle seemed subdued, as if it braced for tragedy. Guards at the gate halted them. Joran announced himself as carrying urgent tidings for Lady Sansa Stark and Lord Davos Seaworth. Recognizing the gravity of the claim, the guards escorted them inside. The courtyard was tense. Blacksmiths labored over battered steel, stable hands rushed to corral anxious horses, and the hush of worry pervaded every corner. Sansa Stark, flanked by Davos, received Joran in the Great Hall. Her face showed signs of strain and resilience in equal measure. Davos wore an expression of grim acceptance. Joran bowed and recounted his ordeal, describing how the White Walkers had crossed the wall, the horrors witnessed, the dire need for unity. Though Sansa had heard rumors, she had lacked proof until now. Davos scowled at the mention of hidden routes beneath the wall. Sansa asked pointed questions about the others' numbers, methods, and weaknesses. They can be killed by dragonglass or Valyrian steel, Joran emphasized. But there are too many for simple steel alone to hold them back. They're already moving toward the Karstark lands or Whitebridge Ford. They won't stop until all is ice and death. Sansa resolved that Winterfell must rally the northern houses, but the north was war-weary. Many lords refused to believe in Walking Dead. Others hesitated, lacking resources. Word must also reach the southern kingdoms. If the realm did not unite, they would all perish. In the following days, Joran and Elisande trained with Winterfell's garrison, teaching them basic tactics against Whites. Archers practiced igniting arrows. Swordsmen learned to target joints and sever limbs to slow the undead. A sense of urgency loomed over every lesson. Scouts returned with increasingly dire news. Hordes of Whites, possibly in the thousands, marched toward the Karstark lands, attempting to flank Winterfell. A war council convened in the Great Hall. Lords Manderly and Glover, among others, debated how best to defend. With Davos's guidance, they selected a narrow pass near an ancient watchtower to stand against the approaching dead. If they could bottleneck the horde, archers might thin their ranks. It was risky, but leaving the undead unchallenged would mean encirclement. Joran volunteered to lead the vanguard. Elisande stood at his side, unwavering. They set out with 300 warriors, Stark guards, knights, a handful of spearmen. This was no grand army, but enough to try and hold a choke point. Sansa's face was grim as she bid them farewell, reminding them that Winterfell itself must stand ready. The journey was a frigid march through snowy hills. fog clung to the ground like a restless spirit. They reached the pass and saw the watchtower perched on a cliff, half crumbled. Quickly, they arranged sharpened stakes at the narrowest point, positioned archers on the hillside, and formed a tight shield wall. The air felt electric with dread. At last, the undead emerged. A sea of whites shuffled forward, eyes aglow, rotting arms outstretched. Some wore scraps of armor from ages past. Others were clad in peasant rags. The stench of decay rose on the wind. Joran shouted the command, and archers released flaming arrows. Many whites fell, but the mass pressed on, heedless of casualties. Like an avalanche, they slammed into the stakes. Screams echoed as undead flesh ripped and bodies were impaled. 2 White Walkers materialized amid the horde, directing them with silent gestures. Archers diverted fire toward them, but the creatures danced aside with impossible grace. Seeing this, Elisand led a group of bowmen up the slope, hoping to rain down arrows from a better angle. In the clash below, the shield wall trembled. Every kill demanded swift destruction of the White's corpse, lest it rise again. The living stepped over their own fallen comrades, desperately setting flames to the dead. Joran found himself face to face with a walker. The creature's ice spear clashed with his Valyrian steel, sending numbing shockwaves through his arms. He fought with everything he had, remembering each feint and strike from old training. Eventually, he caught the walker off balance, driving his blade deep. It shattered in a flurry of icy shards, releasing an unearthly wail. Yet another walker soon replaced it, taller and armed with a curved blade of frost. Joran's muscles were on the brink of failure. Before the walker could deliver a fatal blow, a volley of arrows whistled through the air, one tipped with dragonglass striking the creature's thigh. With a hiss, it withdrew into the swirling fog. Freed from the direct threat, the Whites went into a frenzy, pressing the defenders mercilessly. Hours of brutal combat followed. The pass became a slaughterhouse. Limbs of men and Whites alike littered the snow. Pyres burned high where they could manage. By dusk, the undead finally broke, stumbling aimlessly as if their controlling force had gone. The defenders had won the pass, but at a cost so steep it felt more like defeat. Scores of good fighters lay dead, many more wounded. Shaken, Joran ordered the survivors to burn every body, friend or foe. Elisand moved among the pyres, hair matted with blood, eyes distant. Once the grim work was done, they trudged back to Winterfell, hearts heavy. Sansa and Davos met them in the courtyard, faces darkening at the sight of the decimated ranks. Joran recounted the battle, stressing it was but a fraction of the enemy host. Sansa's resolve tightened. They had to send riders south to beg aid from the other kingdoms. With the north alone, they would never hold against the oncoming night. She asked Joran to carry her pleas, sealed with the dire wolf sigil, to lords in the south. Davos added his own voice, insisting that if the southern crowns did not unite, all would be lost. Though torn by the thought of leaving Winterfell's defense, Joran knew it was necessary. Elisand volunteered to accompany him. Together, they would ride beyond the neck, seeking any allies they could muster. The next morning, after final preparations, they set out. Grim faces watched them depart through the gates. Snow spiraled from a sky the color of cold iron. Every breath Joran took reminded him of the night's inexorable chill closing in on the realm. Still, hope glimmered, fragile but real. They had proven the others could be resisted, at least for a time. Perhaps somewhere in the south lay the means to rally a great host or even a dragon's flame. Perhaps there were more caches of dragonglass waiting to be mined. If they succeeded in unifying the realm, Winterfell would not stand alone. As they trotted past frosted farms and into the winding roads that led south, Joran kept one hand on the hilt of his Valyrian steel sword. He could not dismiss the memory of those cold, blue eyes or the dreadful silence in which the White Walkers moved. He felt them out there, treading across the snow toward unsuspecting villages, toward Winterfell's walls, and eventually toward the very heart of the Seven Kingdoms. But in the hush between gusts of wind, he also sensed the unspoken determination of the living, men and women who refused to kneel before the specter of eternal night. As long as a single sword stood ready, as long as one hearth remained lit, the White Walkers' triumph would not be complete. Each hoofbeat southward became a prayer for unity, for life, for dawn. They rode on, cloaks snapping in the wind, guided by the knowledge that there was no choice but to fight. The White Walkers had turned south before the wall fell, and in doing so, they had unwittingly lit a flame of desperate defiance in the hearts of the living. So long as courage and hope endured, winter's terror would meet fierce resistance. And perhaps, against all odds, the dawn would break once more over a realm that still drew breath. They rode south in a silence broken only by the soft clop of hooves and the ceaseless moan of the wind. The snows grew patchier here, though the chill persisted, an ever-present reminder of the threat they hoped to contain. Joran kept his Valyrian steel sword within easy reach, as if at any moment he expected the dead to burst from the tree line. Elisand rode beside him, equally alert. Neither spoke of their shared fears, but the tension in their posture revealed the weight they carried. Letters bearing Sansa Stark's seal rested in Joran's saddlebag, each part meant a plea for aid against an enemy most southern lords considered legend. The sky above offered little comfort, a sullen gray stretching from horizon to horizon. Even midday felt like dusk. Occasionally they passed a farmstead shuttered tight, with precious few signs of life. Thin smoke from a single chimney sometimes hinted at frightened inhabitants still clinging to their homesteads. Though Joran yearned to stop and reassure them, time pressed, and reassurance without an army to back it meant little. He hoped only that these people would heed warnings, should any come their way, and flee south before winter's horrors arrived at their doorstep. They crossed the edge of the Gift and entered the domain of small northern lords. Here, the land became damp, with marshy patches that hinted at the bogs ahead. Before them lay the Neck, a stretch of swampland notorious for its tricky terrain and hidden paths. In milder seasons, travelers complained of insects and muck that swallowed wagons whole. Now, with the temperatures plummeting, the wetlands had frozen in places, turning treacherous mud into uneven plates of ice. If they could reach Moat Cailin, the ancient stronghold that guarded the causeway, they might find rest and perhaps a few more swords to swell their ranks. On the fourth day, they caught sight of Moat Cailin's ruined towers rising from the bog, somber and half-sunken in the cold, dark earth. Once it had been the formidable shield of the north. But centuries of neglect and repeated conflicts left the walls crumbling and the towers partially collapsed. Still, a garrison of loyal northerners usually manned what remained. Joran hoped for a warm fire and a chance to gather news. They approached the mossy drawbridge with caution. A single guard hailed them from atop the shattered parapet. "State your names and business," he called, voice echoing over the empty courtyard. Joran reined in his horse, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. After giving his name, he announced they bore crucial letters from Lady Sansa Stark requesting safe passage. A painful moment of scrutiny followed. At last, the guard waved them in. Inside, the place was bleak. Only a few men wandered the courtyard, and many of the old keeps were shuttered. Joran dismounted, noticing how thin and underfed the soldiers looked. A wiry man in patched leathers approached, introducing himself as Galbart, the local captain. He eyed Joran's battered armor and Elisand's determined bearing with weary curiosity. "We've heard rumors," Galbart said, leading them to a small side chamber where a meager fire crackled. "They say the dead walk, that the White Walkers are on the march again. Most folks here don't know what to believe. I've a score of men, maybe less, and half are too young or too old to swing a proper blade. If there's truth to these stories, Moat Cailin won't hold long." Joran took Sansa's letter from his satchel, handing it over. "I fought them myself. They're real. These words confirm it. Lady Stark needs men, and the realm as a whole must unite. We head south to plead for support. If you value your lives, fortify this place as best you can, or abandon it if you must. When the dead come, broken walls will not save you." Galbart read the letter. Though sweat beaded on his brow, he gave a curt nod. "We'll do what we can. I'd like to send a few scouts with you, folk who know the marshes better than anyone. They can guide you past the bog devils and find you the quickest path. Time is short, I gather." Elisand gave Joran a glance and he nodded. "We'll accept any help you can offer," she said. "Speed is essential." That night, they shared a simple meal of salted fish and hard bread in a damp hall lit by flickering torches. The men were silent, haunted by the notion that ancient nightmares crept ever closer. Some had families in deeper parts of the Neck or in scattered hamlets. The gloom pressed in from all sides. Joran did his best to offer a few words of encouragement, but hollow promises could not banish the dread. Still, he sensed that each of these soldiers, meager in number though they were, would fight if pressed. Northern blood ran stubborn, unwilling to yield until the last. At first light, 2 scouts joined them, Marlek, a lanky hunter with a curved bow, and Sarita, a quiet woman whose knives and confident stride suggested she knew how to move unseen. Together, they led the group along the winding causeway, past half-frozen marshes where brackish water reflected the leaden sky. The old road was mostly intact, though riddled with cracks. Ice crunched underfoot. The cold had stilled the usual bog gas and insects, making the place eerily silent. As they progressed, Sarita paused to peer at the horizon. "Storm's brewing," she said, nodding at roiling clouds. "Best make haste. If the snows get heavy in the Neck, the roads will vanish." They pressed on with as much speed as safety allowed, horses picking their way carefully. That evening, they made camp on a rare patch of dry ground. Marlek lit a small fire using driftwood carried in a sack. As the flames danced, Joran and Elisand gathered close, discussing routes south. They had to decide whether to veer east toward the Frey's domain or continue straight down the King's Road. The Freys might still hold the twins, Joran said, remembering old tales. If they do, convincing them of anything may be difficult. They're notoriously stubborn and self-serving. But that crossing is essential if the undead spread across the countryside. Elisand frowned. Then perhaps we should try. If we can persuade them to fortify the crossing and grant free passage to any fleeing from the north, it could save lives. But I can't say I trust them. Nor I, Joran admitted. Still, we must at least try. We'll see what tidings we glean further south. If the road remains clear, we can decide on the approach. Next morning, their journey resumed. The predicted storm arrived, a swirl of snow and sharp winds that turned the swamp into a morass of white and gray. Hoofs slipped on slick patches of ice. Their visibility shrank to a few dozen paces. Sarita led them expertly, navigating by half-buried landmarks. Now and then they spotted rotted stakes and wooden causeways, the remains of older paths submerged by time. They reached drier ground after midday where twisted trees gave way to stunted forests. The wind carried a strange hush. Marlek motioned for them to stop, crouching to study the ground. Joran dismounted, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches. He saw footprints in the snow, several sets, too many to be a few travelers. They seemed fresh enough that the wind had not yet obliterated them. Armed men, Marlek whispered. Moving south. Possibly bandits or deserters from the war. Hard to say. We should keep watch. Elisand glanced at Joran. He nodded and they continued more cautiously. If a group of outlaws roamed the edges of the neck, they might be desperate enough to rob travelers. In this bitter season, any supply of food was worth killing for. Worse, if some rumor of the White Walkers had reached them, they might be on the run, caring little for the safety of others. By late afternoon, they rounded a bend and saw smoke drifting from a cluster of wooden huts. A handful of men loitered among them, leaning on spears or crude swords. Joran signaled the group to halt. The men looked up, startled, and quickly formed a line. One of them, a bearded fellow with a scar across his cheek, raised a hand. Halt! You're entering our camp. Joran stood in his stirrups. We've no quarrel with you. We travel south on urgent business. Let us pass and we'll trouble you none. The man exchanged glances with his fellows. A few of them eyed Joran's horse and the supplies strapped to it. One licked his lips in a way that made Joran's stomach tighten. Hungry men, indeed. He slowly rested a hand on the hilt of his sword, letting them see Valyrian steel glint at his side. Elisand nudged her mount forward a step, her own expression unreadable. She said nothing, but the mere sight of another armed fighter might discourage rash moves. Marlek and Sarita stayed behind, bows half-drawn. A tense moment stretched. Then the leader spat into the snow. Fine. We've bigger worries than you. But if you're going south, you'll find little welcome. Word is, lords are hoarding what they can. Maybe you can pass. Maybe not. Either way, this is our land now. Their claims to the land mattered little. Joran gave a curt nod and guided the party forward at a slow walk, never turning his back. The men scowled but parted to let them through. Joran sensed it was only the threat of a hard fight and perhaps the fear of losing more men than they could afford that stayed their hands. When they were well clear of the huts, Elisand released a shaky breath. They looked half-starved, she murmured. Desperate men, dangerous as wolves. Joran agreed. But we can't feed them all. We barely have enough ourselves. The incident added to the weight of hopelessness. Everywhere they went, folk seemed perched on the brink of survival. Winter was no longer a season to endure. It was a harbinger of something far darker. They made camp that night by a half-frozen stream, the last stretch of swamp behind them. With each day's travel, the land began to show signs of more settled territory. Fields, though bare, lay fenced and claimed. Distant windmills stood idle in the gloom. Once they cleared the neck entirely, they would enter the more populous lands of the Riverlands. From there, it was a question of where to seek help first. Marlek and Sarita conferred with Elisand while Joran organized gear. It was decided the scouts would remain with them until they reached an old crossroads, then return north to Moat Cailin. They were needed back home to guide stragglers fleeing the threat. Joran hated to lose their expertise, but it was only fair. Every fortress needed eyes on the roads. 2 mornings later, The group arrived at a weathered signpost leaning precariously. One arrow pointed west, hinting at the path to the Freiheld twins. Another marked the King's Road southward. Here they paused to share final words. Marlek gripped Joran's hand. "Good luck, sir. I hope you find the help you seek." Sarita merely nodded, her gray eyes conveying her unspoken wishes. Then they turned their horses back north, disappearing into the hazy distance. Joran felt a pang of sorrow, for their departure signaled the final unraveling of what little safety the next familiarity offered. Now only he and Elisand remained to press onward. The sky threatened another flurry of snow, the clouds heavy. Joran eyed the western track. "The twins," he murmured. "We could try to speak with the Freys. They control that crossing. If an undead horde appears, the twins must be held, or the Riverlands will be open to them." Elisand's posture stiffened. A necessary gamble. But the Freys' reputation precedes them. They might refuse our plea outright, or demand an extortionate toll. Then again, ignoring them could doom thousands to an attack from the north. With reluctance, Joran nudged his horse along the westward route. The path was muddy despite the freeze, churned by wagon wheels and older hooves. They passed the occasional traveler heading the opposite way, some in small groups, bundled tight, glancing around with anxious eyes. Few exchanged more than a nod. It seemed the entire land was on edge, wary of strangers. Perhaps word of unnatural horrors trickled south in rumors, unverified yet unsettling enough to sow fear. After 2 days, the distinct silhouette of the twins came into view. 2 stout keeps on either side of the Green Fork, connected by a massive stone bridge. In times of war, the Freys could seal the crossing, controlling passage across the wide river. Bannered gatehouses loomed, flags drooping in the wind. Though the fortress looked imposing, Joran noticed fewer men on the battlements than expected, a sign of diminished resources or overconfidence. They approached the main gate on the eastern bank. A sentry atop the wall challenged them. Joran raised his hand. "We come bearing letters from Lady Sansa Stark of Winterfell. We request an audience with your lord. The fate of the realm may well hinge on it." The guard eyed them suspiciously but vanished inside. Joran and Elisand sat astride their horses, exchanging tense looks. At length, the portcullis rattled upward and a pale-faced steward beckoned them in. The twins' courtyard was cleaner than Moat Caelin's, though the air of tension felt the same. Soldiers in tabards bearing the Twin Towers sigil milled about. Most appeared well-fed compared to the starving bandits in the neck, but they too wore cautious expressions. The steward led them across the bridge to the western keep. Its halls were dimly lit with torches and braziers, the stone floors echoing with their footsteps. At last, they reached a modest chamber where a handful of Frey retainers waited. No great banquet table, no welcoming display. Merely a few chairs, a small fire, and the watchful stares of armed guards. At the center stood Lady Jalesia Frey, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an appraising gaze. "Explain yourselves," she commanded. "We are told you bring messages from the Lady of Winterfell." Elisand deferred to Joran, who produced Sansa's sealed letter. "My lady, the White Walkers have crossed the wall. An army of the dead marches south, threatening all of Westeros. Winterfell calls upon every house to unite in defense of the living. We ask that House Frey stand with the north, fortify this crossing, permit safe passage to refugees, and send any fighting men you can spare." Silence stretched as Lady Jalesia broke the seal and scanned the contents. Her face revealed little, but her eyes flickered with some internal calculation. At length, she set the letter aside. "A terrible tale," she said slowly. "But the Freys have suffered in these wars, and our strength is not what it once was. Why should we bleed again for northern battles?" Joran stiffened. "My lady, if the dead reach these lands, it will not be a northern battle. It will be the end of everything. We have seen these creatures. They do not stop, do not negotiate. They kill and raise more dead from the bodies. You will have no choice but to fight or die and join their legion." A flicker of discomfort crossed her features. The guards shifted uneasily. One retainer cleared his throat. "If these White Walkers are real, the crown should handle it. We've heard talk of a queen in the south. Why not beseech her?" "We intend to," Elisand said, "but the threat moves faster than our pleas can travel. If you do nothing and they overrun the north, they will be at your doorstep soon enough. Fortify your towers. Prepare. At least let the innocent pass without robbing them of what they need to survive. If you shut your gates, you will doom countless families." The retainer said nothing more. Lady Jalesia studied them both. Very well. I will discuss this with our council. Meanwhile, you may rest in our guest quarters. You will not be harmed here so long as you abide by our rules. She gestured to a guard. Show them to the west wing. The guard escorted them down a torchlit corridor, depositing them in a sparse room with 2 small beds and a single chest. A narrow window overlooked the river, its surface dark and restless. Once left alone, Joran exhaled. At least we weren't turned away. Elisande sank onto one of the beds, running a hand through her hair. But did you see her face? She's not convinced. And the Freys are notoriously cautious, selfish even. If they sense no immediate advantage, they might refuse to commit any real support. All we can do is wait and hope our words carry weight. Joran glanced at the window, imagining an army of corpses shambling up the King's Road. The Freys would change their tune quickly if such a nightmare appeared at their gates. That night, a meager supper was brought to them, stew with tough bits of meat and a loaf of coarse bread. The guard who delivered it lingered by the door. A younger man, he seemed curious. Is it true, then? He ventured, eyes flicking from Joran's sword to Elisande's face. Are the dead really walking? Joran answered quietly, they are. I've seen them. Fought them. They killed our friends and raised them to fight us. Tell others in this castle to be vigilant. The dead will not care for your house name when they come. The guard left, brow furrowed in evident worry. Joran ate in silence, though the food tasted like ash on his tongue. Sleep came fitfully. His dreams were fraught with images of an immense White Walker legion crossing a half-frozen river, the towers of the twins crumbling like sand under a night sky. He woke just before dawn, heart-pounding. Morning brought more waiting. Finally, as the sun struggled through the clouds, a retainer arrived to summon them. In the same chamber as before, Lady Jalesia stood with 2 older Frey men, presumably her advisors. Her gaze was steely. We have conferred, she said. House Frey will not abandon our duty to the realm. We shall keep the twins fortified and alert for any unnatural threat. Any Northmen or travelers fleeing south will be permitted crossing, though we expect a modest toll for upkeep, nothing extortionate, she added, as if anticipating protest. As for sending men, we can spare only a token force. Our numbers are depleted and the realm's politics remain uncertain. But to show good faith, we will dispatch a small garrison to Winterfell. Relief flickered across Joran's face, though he remained cautious. A token force is better than none. Thank you, my lady. Please, send word quickly and let your soldiers know what they face. With that, it seemed their business was concluded. The Freys were not about to fully mobilize, but they had offered some concessions. It might save lives, if only a few. Joran and Elisande excused themselves. By midday, they were crossing back to the eastern keep, leading their horses through the courtyard. As they rode away, Joran tried to ignore the knot of uncertainty in his gut. A small garrison from the Freys might bolster Winterfell's defenses, or it might arrive too late to matter. They returned to the main road and continued south. Day after day, the countryside expanded. Villages dotted the landscape, some with watchful eyes peering from shuttered windows. Others stood abandoned as if entire populations had vanished in the night. Once they passed a churchyard of fresh graves, too many for one small hamlet to have dug in normal times. Snow dusted the crude headstones and the silence was oppressive. Elisande occasionally exchanged news with travelers on the road, learning scraps of rumor, lords bickering in the capital, unrest in the western hills, calls for levies in the Vale. No one seemed to have a unified plan. The realm lay scattered and preoccupied with internal strife. Joran's frustration grew. They had seen the true menace. Squabbles over crowns and titles meant nothing in the face of an endless winter of death. The closer they drew to the Riverlands, the more obvious the scars of recent wars became. Burned-out farmsteads, scorched fields left to rot, skeletal remains of orchard trees. Though the worst fighting of the War of the Five Kings had ended, the region had not fully recovered. Now, the threat of the White Walkers loomed, poised to tear apart what little remained. One evening, as they camped beneath a bare willow beside a half-frozen creek, Elisande gazed at the water's dark surface. Do you think we'll reach the Queen, or whoever holds sway in kin? G's Landing, in time to rally them? Or will they dismiss us, as so many have dismissed the North's warnings before? Joran poked at the small campfire, sending sparks dancing into the cold air. I can't say, but we have no choice. Even if the Southern Crown offers a mere fraction of its knights, it could be enough to bolster the defenses. We must try. Otherwise, every city, from Winterfell to Old Town, could become a tomb. She nodded, her expression pensive. I want to believe we can make a difference, that all those we lost weren't lost in vain. He set a comforting hand on her shoulder, though the gesture felt inadequate. "We've already made a difference. We sealed at least one tunnel under the wall. We warned Winterfell, fought in the pass, convinced the Freys to send some help. Each victory is a spark in the darkness." She offered a thin smile. "Let's hope these sparks catch flame before the night claims everything." They traveled onward. Occasionally, they detoured to avoid large rivers or broken bridges, their progress slowed by winter's ravages. With each league, the nights grew a little less bitter, as if the North's frozen claws were easing their grip. Yet the heaviness in Joran's chest remained. He knew that the physical warmth of southern lands meant little if the White Walkers continued their march unchecked. When at last they neared the outskirts of Harrenhal, a castle rumored to be cursed and ruined, they saw its melted towers looming against a gray sky. Smoke rose from within the massive walls, suggesting occupation. Perhaps a local lord had taken up residence in the old fortress, hoping its thick curtain walls would offer security. Harrenhal's size and central location often made it an object of ambition, but rarely did it bring those who claimed it anything but misfortune. They approached cautiously, crossing the wide moat on a creaking wooden bridge. Guards in mismatched armor stood at the gate. One stepped forward, frowning at Joran's battered shield and Elisand's weather-stained cloak. "State your business," he said. "We are travelers carrying urgent messages from the north," Joran replied. "To whom does Harrenhal belong now?" The guard hesitated. "Lord Royce holds the castle at present, by arrangement. He's sworn to the Vale's regent, or so it's said." "What news from the north?" "We bring word of the White Walkers," Joran answered, voice grave. "Is Lord Royce here? We must speak with him." The guard exchanged a look with his fellow, then nodded sharply. "Wait here. I'll see if he'll receive you." In time, they were escorted inside. Harrenhal's sprawling courtyard seemed half-abandoned, but a contingent of knights and men-at-arms bustled in a corner, practicing archery. An older man with broad shoulders and streaks of gray in his hair stood observing them. This Joran guest was Lord Royce. The guard led them over, and the man turned, revealing a face lined with weariness. "Well met," Royce said, regarding them with cautious courtesy. "I hear you've come from the far north with dire news." Joran slid from his horse, bowing. "Yes, my lord. The White Walkers have breached the wall. They move south. We need every lord, every kingdom, to unite before it's too late." Royce's eyes darkened. "I've heard rumors, ravens from the Eyrie and from Winterfell. I was uncertain how much to believe. Yet your face tells me you've seen the horrors firsthand." "I have," Joran said. "I've fought them. They are no mere tales. Please, if you have men or can influence the Vale's leadership, urge them to send reinforcements. Winterfell stands, but not without cost." Royce folded his arms. "The Vale is cautious, especially under Lady Erin's counsel. Still, there are knights who would ride if convinced of the threat. We're reorganizing here before returning to the Vale. I'll dispatch word of your testimony, but I can't promise how swiftly they'll come to arms." Elisand lifted her chin, determination in her gaze. "Any delay could be fatal. The undead do not rest or negotiate. If the Vale remains neutral, its armies might survive a while, hidden behind the mountains of the moon, but eventually the dead will breach even that. No fortress is impregnable to a legion that never tires." Royce exhaled, nodding grimly. "You speak truth. I'll do what I can. Harrenhal is no comfortable seat, but you may stay the night if you wish. In the morning, I ride east. Perhaps you should continue south to the Crownlands, press your case at King's Landing. If you can sway the Iron Throne, we might see a coalition formed." That evening, Joran and Elisand found themselves in a drafty hall eating a sparse meal alongside Lord Royce's knights. Conversation centered on the uncertainty of the realm, whether the Targaryen line persisted or if another house had seized power. Reports were muddled, but one thing was clear. Infighting plagued the southern courts, with alliances shifting like sand. A perfect environment for the White Walkers to exploit if they advanced this far. At dawn, Royce and his company departed east, leaving a modest garrison behind. Joran and Elisand bade them farewell, setting their own course south toward the capital. The roads grew busier, with merchants leading donkey carts, peasants trudging with rag-wrapped feet, and soldiers wearing the colors of lesser lords. Most had never seen the White Walkers, so the rumor of an undead invasion sounded no different than half the wild stories that drifted through the countryside. Many simply shrugged off Joran's warnings. "We'll believe it when we see it," one surly merchant said, spitting on the ground. "The High Lords talk of doom every year or two. Ain't none of them come to save my farm from bandits or the next tax levy, though." Joran pressed on, too exhausted to argue. It became clear that unless the realm's leadership took decisive action, ordinary folk would remain skeptical until the dead were literally at their gates. He could only hope that official decrees or the presence of an allied army might force them to face reality. Several days further on, they traversed muddy roads that led through farmlands scarred by old battles. The capital lay ahead, though the land around it seemed subdued. At last, from a rise in the road, they glimpsed the distant sprawl of King's Landing, sprawling districts hemmed by walls, the Red Keep perched on a promontory above the Blackwater Rush. Joran recalled that the city was often described as a place of intrigue and squalor, hope and despair, all jammed together under the weight of 1,000 politics. They approached the gate at midday. The smell hit them first, a pungent blend of refuse, tanneries, and too many people living too closely. Guards in tarnished plate and mismatched surcoats stood watch, eyes half-lidded from boredom or cynicism. Joran announced their arrival, brandishing Sansa Stark's letters. The guard captain scowled, then shrugged. "If you say so, we'll let you through, but you'd best see the proper officials if you want an audience with the crown." Inside the walls, the city was a riot of noise and movement. Fishermen hawked their catches, street urchins dodged between carts, and the press of bodies made travel slow. Elisande rode close, one hand on her sword's pommel. They made for the Red Keep with measured caution. Any false move in King's Landing, Joran had heard, could end with a knife in the back. At the fortified gates of the keep, they faced more guards, these bearing the sigil of the reigning monarch, a crowned dragon. Rumors suggested a tenuous Targaryen claim still flickered here. Or perhaps a regent served in that capacity. Nothing was certain in these times. Joran repeated his purpose, urgent news from the north, dire warnings of the undead. Eventually, they were led past the portcullis into a courtyard where they dismounted under the wary eyes of stable hands. A court official in fine robes strode out, brow furrowed. "You've come from Winterfell, you say? And you carry letters from Lady Sansa Stark? Let me see." He flicked his fingers impatiently. Joran offered the sealed parchment. After scanning it, the man's face darkened with concern. "This is quite a claim. White Walkers, an army of the dead. We've heard scattered rumors. The crown has many matters to address, rebellions in the Stormlands, border skirmishes near Dorne. Yet if the North calls for aid, it cannot be dismissed out of hand. Wait here." He disappeared through large doors, leaving Joran and Elisande alone in the stone courtyard. Servants hurried about, delivering food and supplies. Far above, the ramparts bristled with archers on watch as though expecting an assault at any moment. Perhaps unrest in the realm had grown more dangerous than the officials wished to admit. Time dragged. When the court official returned, he was accompanied by two stern-faced guards. "Come," he said tersely. "You'll speak to the hand of the king. Quickly now." They followed him through grand corridors and up a flight of winding stairs, eventually arriving at a hall flanked by ornate pillars. There, upon a modest dais, sat a figure in rich attire, a badge shaped like a hand pinned to his chest. He was lean, with silvered hair and intense eyes. Before Joran could bow, the man motioned them closer. "I am Lord Vaynor, Hand of the King," he said. "The king is indisposed, and I conduct most affairs of state. You bring urgent news from the north. State it plainly." Joran did as told. White Walkers, crossing the wall, armies of the dead, pleas for unity. He spoke with the passion of one who had seen the horrors firsthand, detailing each grim detail. Elisande corroborated the story, her voice clear and resolute. When they finished, a hush fell over the hall, broken only by the faint crackle of torches. Lord Vaynor steepled his fingers. "These are dark tidings. We have had conflicting reports, some claiming the undead are but tales, others describing sightings near the gift. The crown cannot act rashly on rumor alone. Yet neither can we risk ignoring a threat so grave." He glanced at an attendant. "Summon the Grand Maester. We must verify this at once." The hours that followed were an ordeal of questions and formalities. The Grand Maester arrived, poked and prodded at any sign of frostbite or scars. Joran was forced to recount his battles. Elisande described the Whites' relentless nature. They exhibited Sansa's sealed letters, which repeated the call for aid. At last, near nightfall, Lord Vaynor spoke again. "You will stay in the keep while I consult with the king and the small council. The realm is weary from endless internal strife, but if what you say is true, all these petty disputes must be set aside. The king might muster forces or at least dispatch negotiators to coordinate with the north." Joran and Elisande exchanged a glance of weary gratitude. It was not a promise of immediate action, but it was far better than outright dismissal. The dead advanced with each passing day. If the crown delayed too long, the realm's armies might mobilize too late. They were given a small set of chambers in the Red Keep's guest wing, plain but comfortable compared to roadside camps. Servants brought them a modest meal, and they finally allowed themselves a measure of rest. As Joran lay on a feather-stuffed mattress, he found his thoughts drifting back to Castle Black, to the men and women who had bled and died fighting the White Walkers. He pictured the battered walls of Winterfell, the exhausted eyes of Sansa Stark. He recalled the flash of unnatural blue in a White Walker's gaze as it raised an army of corpses. Would the king truly heed the warning? Or would political games overshadow the urgent need for unity? Joran wanted to hope that the realm's leaders would see reason and rise to meet the threat. But cynicism gnawed at him. Too many times in history, great houses had turned on each other instead of banding together. If they failed again, Winter's doom would devour them all. Still, the simple fact that they had been allowed an audience, that the hand of the king seemed at least partially convinced, gave him a sliver of optimism. Tomorrow, they would learn more. For now, he could do nothing but rest and wait, carried along by the tide of events. Sleep overtook him in mid-thought, the flickering candlelight dancing across the walls like fleeting ghosts. Morning broke gray and cold, the wind rattling shutters set high in the Red Keep's battlements. Joran rose, dressed, and met Elisand in the hallway. Together, they stepped into the uncertain halls of power, hoping their warnings would not fall on deaf ears. Their mission had brought them this far, through battles with the dead, through backwater fortresses and half-frozen bogs, through the reluctant courtesy of the Freys and the measured reception of Harrenhal. Now they stood at the heart of the Seven Kingdoms, ambassadors of a nightmare that threatened to plunge the world into endless winter. They could only pray that somewhere behind these red stone walls a spark of unity and resolve would ignite before the White Walkers arrived to snuff it out. And as they followed a steward to the council chamber, Joran inhaled slowly, steadying himself. In every footstep, he carried the memory of comrades lost and the promise he had made on that first bloody field north of the wall, that he would fight for the living until his final breath, no matter the odds. Outside, a raven soared across the pale sky. Perhaps it bore fresh tidings from Winterfell, or the Vale, or even Moat Cailin. Perhaps it carried news of another victory, or another defeat, or yet another horrifying glimpse of the army of the dead. But Joran could not know, not yet. All he knew was that each breath he took was borrowed time against a gathering storm. He would use every moment to fight for a dawn that might banish the long night, for in the end, that was all any mortal man could do against the creeping cold of death.